Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Well, welcome, everyone. It's it's absolutely delightful to be back with all of you. Hi, Jeff. I've been communicating with Jeff over email, so that's been quite delightful. So I'll be here with all of you. We'll be all together for actually the next 3 weeks, which I'm really excited by. Jeff actually invited me to give a series, and so just to give you an overview of this series, the name of this talk, what we'll focus on today, is called "When We Polarize, We Suffer." So I'll be touching into both our outer and inner responses to our recent presidential election. When we polarize, we suffer. And then next week, the title of the talk will be The Embodied Imagination, Doorways to Liberation. The Embodied Imagination, Doorways to Liberation. And on the third week, the name of the talk will be entitled, Everything is Perfectly Imperfect. Everything is perfectly imperfect. So the framework that is beneath this journey that we'll take is really the progression of Buddhism, called the three great turnings of the Dharma wheel. So the first great turning of the Dharma wheel refers to the actual teachings of the Buddha. So sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the Hinayana path. And then the second turning of the wheel is called the Mahayana path. And the third great turning of the wheel is called the Vajrayana path. So Hinayana and Mahayana, these two terms, Hinayana means the small way, and Mahayana means the great way. And you can probably guess that it's the Mahayanas who came up with the term Hinayana. So actually, I will follow in the footsteps of Analayo, who doesn't use this term. Actually, many Buddhists do not use this term, Hinayana. And some people will refer to it as the Theravada school. Which also is not technically correct. So what Analayo says is he just refers to it as early Buddhism. So this is early Buddhism of the Pali canon. So it's the teachings that come directly from the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha. So week one, we're going to focus on early Buddhism of the Pali canon, the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. When we polarize, we suffer. So we'll be exploring this experience of suffering in an embodied way, and also be exploring why it is that we suffer. The following week, we'll be entering into the Mahayana, the embodied imagination, doorways to liberation. And one can think of the second and third turnings of the wheel, the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, as really method. There's different doorways to realizing these truths. So there's doctrine, which we will get from the Pali canon, which will be the focus of today's talk. And then there's method. And it's very important to discover the method that works for us individually. So it's said in Buddhism that there are 84,000 different doorways, Dharma doors. And what is important is to discover the Dharma doorways that work for us. So unless we want to become a Buddhist scholar, right, if that was our goal, to become a Buddhist scholar, then we might be inspired to explore all 84,000 doorways. And that's not what we're doing here. So it's important for all of us to discover the doorways that work for us. So I'll be sharing some doorways that work for me, and also be suggesting doorways that you might explore. So the Mahayana emphasizes the embodied imagination. So we'll be exploring that next week. And then in the final week, the third week, we'll really focus on the Vajrayana path. Everything is perfectly imperfect. So I'd like to emphasize that the aspect of just embodied knowing. So today I will be focused on intellectual understanding, because it is very important to have an intellectual understanding of some of the key teachings of what the Buddha taught. And a very common spiritual cul-de-sac for Westerners is to mistake an intellectual understanding for embodied knowing. Actually, that's the basis of our modern Western educational system. It actually stops at intellectual understanding in general. So it's very important in Buddhism to recognize that intellectual understanding is really just the first step in a long journey. So intellectual understanding is where we begin. And that intellectual understanding, we need to reflect upon the teachings of the Buddha. How does it relate to my own direct experience? And if I want to, and if I move to embody these teachings, to really realize the truths that these teachings are pointing at, how would I go about doing that? So now we get into method and this deepening of our practice, where the intellectual understanding can go down, can go up, and it can then become embodied knowing. So I'd actually like to begin this journey with a little practice of embodied experiencing. So I'd just like to chant for you something I chant every day. It's called the Buddha Puja. And I chant this in Pali, which is a language of ancient India, that all the teachings of the Buddha were written down in Pali. And one of the reasons, there's many reasons why I love to chant this in Pali, is first, it connects me directly with the Buddha. It connects me with this stream of practice, this stream of teachings that's been handed down from one generation to the next for 2,600 years. And it has incredibly and magically and mysteriously come down to me. And now I can step into this stream of practice and share it with all of you. Another beautiful thing about chanting is it bypasses our cognitive faculties. And there's no words in English to grab onto and, well, what does that mean? Form is emptiness, emptiness is fun. There's no opportunities to spin out with our thinking minds. And also, in the Vajrayana tradition, the melodies are sacred. So if one is engaged in a Vajrayana practice and one learns mantras, one learns various sacred texts for recitation, there are melodies that are associated with these. And one must learn the melodies because they are sacred melodies. So those of you who have a strong relationship with music will know that melodies they speak directly to the heart. You know, music can speak directly to the heart and bypass the mind. So I'll just chant this for everyone, for all of us. So let's just make ourselves comfortable in our bodies. Just let go of anything you might be holding on to. And just come here into the present moment. And let's all just be here now. The Buddha Puja. Vanaganda guno petang etang kusuma santati pujayami munindasa Siddhipada saroruhe Pujami buddhang kusume nanena Puyena metena labami mokkang Pufang milayati yata hidang me Kayo tathayati vinasabhavam Ganasarapaditena Ditena tamadansina Tilokadipang sambudhang Pujayami tamonudang Sugandhikaya varanang Ananta gunagandhina Sugandhina hang gandena Pujayami tathagatam Buddhang dhammang cha sanghang Sugatatanubhava Datu datu gabe Lankayang jambudipe Tidasapuravare Nagaloke chatupe Sabbe buddhassa bimbe Sakalata sadise Kesalomadi datu vande Sabbe bibuddhang Dasabala tanujang Bodhichetyang namami Vandami chetyang sabang Sabbatane supatititang Saririkadatu mahabodhi Buddharupang sakalang sada. job, yeah. Yeah, this word mantra, man, comes from the word manas, which means mind, and tra means protection. So this word mantra, it means that which protects the mind. So chanting in Pali, it's a way of protecting the mind, reminding ourselves of our heart's deepest wish. We'll explore that more in depthly next week when we enter into the Mahayana. Okay, so for this week, we're going to focus on early Buddhism and the Pali canon. And a very good place to start is with the Four Noble Truths. And today we're going to focus on the first and the second of the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths are, the first one being the noble truth of suffering. The second noble truth is the cause of suffering, which is greed, hatred, and delusion. The third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the path that leads towards the cessation of suffering, namely the Eightfold Path. So this is just a pure doctrinal, it's textbook Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths. So let's start with the first noble truth of the truth of suffering. So the Buddha speaks about two different kinds of suffering. And in the Pali canon, he speaks about physical suffering and mental suffering. And just to be very clear about this, you can't really, in a way, you can't really separate these things. Everything is all very interrelated. So psychosomatic suffering, is that bodily suffering? Is it physical suffering? Is it mental suffering? It's kind of all mixed together. But I do think it is helpful to think about this notion of two types of suffering. And this comes out very clearly in what's called the Salatena Sutta, or the teaching of the two arrows, which is quite popular, so I imagine some of you may have heard this. The two arrows or the two darts. And what I'd like to do is just read straight from the Pali canon, and then we can explore this theme, this notion of suffering. So this is from the Salatena Sutta, and Sala means dart, which commonly is translated as arrow. And I'll use the translation of dart. So in this teaching, the Buddha is addressing his disciples. Mendicants, when an uninstructed ordinary person is touched by painful feelings, they experience sorrow, beating their breasts and falling into confusion. They wail and lament. It is like a person who is struck with a dart, only to be struck with a second dart. That person experiences the feeling of two darts. And being touched by painful feelings, they show aversion towards them. When they show aversion towards the painful feelings, the latent tendency of aversion towards painful feeling lies latent in them. It's like a person who is struck with a dart, only to be struck with a second dart. That person experiences the feeling of two darts. So that's the teaching. So to bring it into our own direct experience, let's say you're walking down the sidewalk and you got a whole bunch of stuff to do and you're talking on the phone and oh, I got to do this, I got to do, and you trip and fall. And all your stuff goes all over the sidewalk and maybe you scrape your knee. So there's physical pain associated with scraping your knee. Maybe you bump your elbow. It's like, ouch. And then what happens? The mind just kind of goes, oh, I'm such an idiot. I can't believe I should be paying attention. Now I got to do all this stuff. It's right? The mind can do that. It likes to just spin out of control. Our monkey minds, they like action. Like an action movie. And action. So the first dart is just simply falling. You don't want to fall. You don't want to scrape your knee. You fall, you scrape your knee. There is pain associated with that. The second dart is what the mind makes of that, how the mind responds to our experience of physical pain. And this is what the Buddha calls the second dart. So the Buddha is very clear about this, about making this distinction between two darts, two forms of suffering. And Buddhism is really about freeing ourselves from this second dart. It's not about freeing ourselves from the first dart. We live in these human bodies, I cut myself, I will experience pain. That's just a given. The Buddha, in terms of suffering, the truth of suffering, is really speaking about psychological suffering, how we can create suffering in our own minds. And the Buddha goes on to say in the second noble truth, the cause of suffering is greed, hatred, and delusion. And so that's the straight teaching. And now to enter into this teaching experientially, I'd like to speak about how we suffer, and specifically what the Buddha says about how we suffer. So, we're all creatures of habit, and we're all creatures of comfort. And this is actually, it's evolutionary. It's the same with animals. Right? All animals are creatures of habit and creatures of comfort. So when we're first born, we need food, clothing, and shelter. We need protection. And when we don't get those things, we cry. Babies cry. Right? So it's completely instinctual and evolutionary to want to survive. And survival means comfort. So this is just our starting point. But then what can happen, actually what does happen, is we become fixated with comfort. This is just simply the human condition. And our views become distorted around this. So here's a here's a good example. Actually, I'll just speak about my own experience here. So as a child, I had an older brother. I have an older brother. And he used to bully me. And at a fairly young age, I decided, like, he's too big, too mean, and there's no way I can win. So I'm just going to stop talking. And that's, it takes two to fight. And if I just stop talking, then all my problems will go away. And it actually worked. So in retrospect, I imagine myself having one of those Harry Potter cloaks of invisibility. I would just simply turn invisible, just shut my mouth. And sure enough, my brother just got bored of picking on me. Yeah. It's no fun to pick on someone who doesn't fight back. So at a very early age, I learned that to have an opinion opens one up for attack. It's not safe to have an opinion. It's not safe to take up space. You just simply become a target. So I actually internalized this way of thinking. For me to be safe, I need to withdraw into my own little fantasy world. And this is exactly what happened. This is a distortion of perception, according to the Buddhist teachings. So as a child, this coping mechanism, it served me extremely well. It actually did protect me. However, as an adult, it actually holds me back and binds me to suffering. So then what can happen as an adult for me is if I'm interacting with someone and this other person I'm interacting with voices a very strong and emotionally charged opinion, position, and really advocating for their own position, I will have this deeply ingrained tendency to run away, and just find the place of safety and disappear. This is what's referred to in the Pali canon as a distortion of perception. Trauma. Trauma gets in the bones. These habitual tendencies, they actually get in the bones. And the path of liberation is to recognize these stories from the past as simply stories from the past. They're echoes from the past. And we very easily become the story. We forget that these are stories, and these stories get reactivated. So perception, this word is a translation of the Pali word samya. And sanya is, you may recognize this if you've ever come across the five skandhas. Samya is one of the five skandhas. And perception is the way it's translated. I prefer the term recognition, the translation recognition. So sam means together, and ya means to know. So samya, this word perception, it means to know together. So it's pattern matching, to know together. So, for example, this is a bell. Well, how do I know that? Well, in my mind, in my memory, I've got an image of a bell in my mind. And that image has entered my mind from the past. And then I look at something in the present, and I pattern match. I say, oh, that's a bell. So it's recognizing It's bringing something from the past into the present, samya, to recognize. Well, our recognition, our samya, can become distorted by this act of bringing things from the past into the present. So, as a child, I turned invisible. That served me well. As an adult, when I turn invisible, that actually binds me to suffering. I suffer when I turn invisible. So this tendency to turn invisible, samya, it becomes what the Buddha calls a latent tendency. So latent tendency is a translation of the Pali word anusaya, latent tendency. And our latent tendencies are our deeply ingrained habitual tendencies. These are both bodily and mental. So anusaya, latent tendencies. I picked up the latent tendency from my childhood of I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to take up space. My voice doesn't matter. So this is very common. This is very common. I'm not worthy. I'm not lovable. I'm not good enough. I'm a fraud. All these things. It's very common with our modern day society. And they are latent tendencies. It's very interesting to think about them as latent tendencies. So the misunderstanding is we become the story. So this notion of I am this. There's this really beautiful story from the Pali canon where it illustrates this notion of latent tendencies as just simply being echoes from the past. So this is one of the doorways towards freedom. So in the Pali canon, the Buddha is he gets a splinter in his toe. So he's lying down, and Mara appears. So in the Pali canon, Mara represents all the ways in which we are self-defeating and self-deprecating. They're all the internalized forces that hold us back, that bind us to suffering. So Mara is the voice that is saying, you're not good enough, you're not worthy, you're not lovable, just give up. So the Buddha's lying there with a splinter in his toe, and Mara appears. And Mara says to the Buddha, oh, yeah, I see you're just, relaxing. That's good, you're resting. You've been teaching for many decades now. You've got this huge Sangha, and you've got all these great disciples, and you're old. I think maybe you should just go back to the palace, and you can just live the rest of your days out in comfort, and you can just read poetry and just lay around just like this and just relax and just let your disciples take over. So this is what Mara is saying to the Buddha. And the Buddha sees Mara for who Mara is and simply just says, thank you, but off you go. Run along, run along. And Mara slinks away defeated. So that's the whole story in the Pali canon. So the reason I find this story so incredibly fascinating, right, is even after one gets enlightened, the Buddha was enlightened, Mara still comes. There's still the thought of, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy. But the Buddha recognizes this as just simply an echo from the past. So there it is, it's arising. I don't have to become this story. I'm just going to let this go. Actually, there isn't even that thought of letting it go. Letting it go is more of an active recognition of something has come in that's like, ooh, this is not good, I need to let this go. What the Buddha is doing is, rather than letting it go, the Buddha is just letting it be. Letting go, letting be. So to let be, to let something be, is, oh wow, here's that echo from the past. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. It's all it is. It's an echo from the past. Just let it be. And when we let things be, they naturally fade away. The Buddha said this. Everything that has the nature of arising also has the nature of fading away. So when we're able to develop this skill of letting things be, they will just naturally fade away. So the Buddha has this wisdom of not becoming the story. So I think this is really important from a practice standpoint. It's very common, I'll call it a mistake. I embodied this mistake for many, many years. A mistake to think that there are these aspects of ourselves that are, air quotes, bad, and I need to somehow transform them. I need to drive them out. And I need to cultivate these good things, and I need to keep out these bad things. If only I could be free of this, like this tendency to turn invisible. If only I could be free. That's actually a grand mistake. It's not about cutting off and cutting out the bad parts of ourselves. Right? It's not like it's a cancer that needs to be removed by a surgeon. Rather, the path of liberation is actually around accepting ourselves just the way we are and recognizing that we can be anything that we want, actually. So now we're getting into the truth of impermanence. Like the Buddha taught us, everything is impermanent. Everything is constantly changing. So I think this is very easy to understand as an idea. So we can just pause right now and just ask ourselves this question. You can ask yourself in your own minds, can you think of anything that's permanent? I can. So let me know if anybody can. No? I can't. Okay. Got it. I'm done.
Danadasa?
Yes.
Is impermanence permanent?
That's a very good question. And
Sorry.
no, that's a very good question. And then the question actually, this is what the Buddha would then ask: is that question helpful? Right? That's what the Buddha would ask. Is that question helpful? So I'm going to ask a different question. In your own inner experience of who you think you are, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, for example, is there anything in your inner experience that feels permanent? Is there anything in your inner experience that feels permanent?
Consciousness, awareness, beginningless awareness.
Okay, we're going to do a little guided meditation here. And what I'm going to invite everyone to do is to bring to mind a deeply ingrained habitual tendency that you feel you want to be free of because it creates suffering for you. So this may be an addictive tendency. This may be the way you respond in a particular way to your partner or to your primary caregiver, whatever it may be. But some deeply ingrained habitual tendency you have that you just feel bleh about and you would just love to be free of. Okay? So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to guide this. It's just going to take a couple minutes. So I'd like to invite everyone just to bring this negative, habitual tendency to mind, this inner tendency. And just notice what stories arise in your mind, what narratives. And just notice what's arising in your heart, the emotional tone of your heart. And also notice any physical sensations that are co-arising. Perhaps a sense of tightness or constriction in your heart, or your shoulders, or your forehead. Perhaps a sensation of heat. And now, let's remind ourselves that the Buddha taught that all things are impermanent. Even this specific habitual tendency. And the Buddha taught in the third noble truth that it's possible to be free of this tendency. Without impermanence, transformation would simply not be possible. Okay, I need to wrap this up for this. So I'd like to say something very briefly about our most recent presidential election. And many people I know feel a sense of heightened anxiety and polarization. And the theme of today's when we polarize, we suffer. Although I didn't say much about that. Yeah, it's very painful. It's very painful. One person's truth is another person's conspiracy theory. And it's very painful. It feels like there's no way out, regardless of which end of the political spectrum you find yourself in. And it's deeply polarized. The speech in public is so polarizing, so vitriolic, just, ugh. Ah. And it's very important for us as citizens to do what we can to create a more positive world that's more aligned with our own inner values, whatever that may mean to you. So I'll just speak for myself. I voted for Kamala Harris, and I am in a state of heightened anxiety around the results of this presidential election. And it's very important as someone who is engaged with the world to not allow the toxicity of the outer world to cause me to become depleted and frustrated and just angry. So there is the external world and there's the internal world. And it's very important for us as Buddhists, as well as for anyone engaged in social activism, political activism, to have the skill of, develop the skill of being able to engage creatively with the outer world, as well as having a space that we can retreat into, our inner world, a bounded space where we can actually discover a sense of safety. And it is in this bounded space of practice that we can cultivate emotional resilience and knowing how to set healthy boundaries and knowing how to protect ourselves from the what we may see as evil forces out there. So we have to learn the skill of staying grounded, being grounded, staying nourished. We don't want to become depleted. It's such an important time to really cultivate these skills. So I'll be saying more about this next week, about bounded practice, withdrawing into retreating into solitude, and then engaging with the world. Yeah. So unfortunately we're out of time, so I'm just going to have to leave it at that. But hope to see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.